Most people looking to lose weight or improve their diet will come across macronutrient ratios, the ratio of carbohydrate, protein and fat calories to total calories. Following a specific ratio means to focus on or restrict certain food groups. A low-carb diet restricts the intake of sugar, flour products, fruits, starches, grains and legumes. A low-fat diet restricts the intake of most processed foods, most animal products, vegetable oils, avocados, olives, nuts and seeds. A high-protein diet focuses on animal products, soy products and/or legumes and might include a protein powder or protein bar. We don't recommend following any specific macronutrient ratio, especially not low-carb or high-protein. If you eat an overall healthy dietary pattern, your macronutrient ratio will be fine anyway. Reasonable range fat. There are two groups of essential fatty acids, omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids. The necessary amounts are surprisingly small, in the order of a few grams per day. You should still pay attention. But fat also plays a role in the bioavailability of other nutrients. The minimum intake for fat is around 25 to 30 grams of fat per day, which should include omega-3 rich fat sources, like ground flax seeds or omega-3 rich nuts. As a ratio of fat calories to total calories, this comes out to be around 10 to 12%, 15 to 20% when in a calorie deficit. There are special circumstances in which such a low-fat diet is useful. For example, as a low-fat whole food plant-based diet to combat heart disease or insulin resistance. For healthy and moderately active people, 25% of calories, which is around 55 to 70 grams of fat, is a good target. The more active you are, the more useful a higher fat ratio becomes to fit more calories in smaller amounts of food. Remember to subscribe to our channel. Reasonable range protein. Minimal protein requirements are also surprisingly small. The average protein requirement is only about 0.4 grams per kilogram lean body mass. The recommended intake for the general population is 0.8 to 1.2 grams per kilogram lean body mass, depending on age and other factors. This is about 40 to 90 grams of protein per day, depending on lean body mass. Those looking to preserve or build muscle should eat more protein, up to around 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kilogram lean body mass, which is 60 to 120 grams. In terms of calorie percentages, the recommended intake is about 10 to 15% calories from protein, 15 to 20% in a calorie deficit. Even if you eat more protein in order to preserve or build muscle, with or without a calorie deficit, more than 25% of calories from protein is rarely necessary. For a very high lean body mass over 75 kilograms, more than 120 grams of protein can be appropriate. If you are unsure how much protein you need, go for about 15% of total calories. Fat and protein restrictions. For most adults, 55 to 70 grams of fat is a good range. Lower is fine too, especially if you want to minimize saturated fat intake, but much higher is not recommendable. Saturated fat intake should be below 20 grams, even better below 15 grams per day, especially if you are sedentary. Animal fats and tropical vegetable oils are very high in saturated fat. In butter and many cheeses, more than 60% of the contained fat is saturated fat. In tropical vegetable oil, nearly all fat is saturated fat, and even olive oil contains 15% saturated fat. If you want to keep your saturated fat intake around 15 grams, and your fat sources contain around 30% saturated fat on average, you can eat at most 50 grams of total fat a day. Even if you go for 20 grams of saturated fat, and your fat sources contain 20% of saturated fat on average, you can still only eat 100 grams of fat a day. So choose foods low in saturated fat and keep your fat intake in the recommended range. In practice, minimize or avoid vegetable oils and fatty animal products. Eating too much protein, especially animal protein, can have detrimental effects. Animal protein causes an inflammatory kidney response called hyperfiltration mode, which might lead to a long-term decline in kidney function. Branched-chain amino acids are also linked to insulin resistance, the underlying mechanism of type 2 diabetes. Let's recap. The minimum intake of fat and protein is surprisingly low, around 10 to 15% of calories. For fat, 25% of total calories is a good target. The more active you are, the more useful a higher fat intake becomes, because of the high calorie density. For protein, 10 to 15% of total calories easily covers most people's protein needs. In a calorie deficit, that would be 15 to 20%. To preserve or build muscle, 15 to 25% is sufficient in most cases, depending on your total calorie intake. If you eat more than 150 grams of protein a day, you are probably eating too much protein. To keep your saturated fat intake low enough, you have to choose fat sources with low saturated fat content and limit your overall fat intake. Eating too much animal protein might damage your kidneys and increase type 2 diabetes risk. Reasonable range carbs. Carbohydrates are our body's preferred fuel, or more specific, complex carbs high in fiber are our body's favorite source of energy. Fruits, starchy vegetables, intact grains and legumes. There are no restrictions on healthy carbohydrate-rich foods, as with fat or protein-rich foods. So we fill up on healthy complex carbs. There is a broad range of reasonable carbohydrate ratios. On a low-fat, low-protein diet, it might go as high as 70%. On a high-fat, high-protein diet, it might go as low as 40%. Yes, 40% of calories from carbs is a very low-carb diet. Sure, some people restrict their carb intake even further, by following a ketogenic diet for example. We do not recommend such diets outside of medical necessity. Balanced macros myth. If you come across macronutrient ratios that appear balanced, as in 40% carbs, 30% protein and 30% fat or similar, be aware that these macronutrient ratios are far from balanced. This ratio in particular describes a very low carb, high fat, ultra high protein diet. If we want to come up with balanced macronutrients, it would be closer to 60% carbs, 15% protein and 25% fat, plus minus 5% for each macronutrient. We do come closer in terms of numbers if we look at a large calorie deficit. In that case, we want to keep the absolute intake of protein constant, and we might keep or lower our fat intake. Lowering can make weight loss easier. This results in 50% carbs, 20% protein and 30% fat. Personally, I would lower the fat intake to easily achieve a calorie deficit, so more like 60% carbs, 20% protein and 20% fat. You do not need to worry too much about these ratios. If you eat a large variety of foods, including healthy complex carbs, you will easily fall into these reasonable macronutrient ratios. You should focus on your food choices instead. For example, if you want to manage your weight more easily, eat lots of low-calorie dense foods, such as vegetables, fruits, starches, intact grains and legumes, and less calorie-dense foods like oils, animal fats, cheese and processed foods. If you want to eat a healthier diet, avoid trans fats and keep saturated fats and sodium low. In terms of foods, this means to minimize processed foods, tropical vegetable oils and animal products, or to cut them out altogether. In addition, eat lots of whole plant foods, including some nuts and seeds. Let's summarize. With the restrictions on fat and protein intake, we fill up the remaining calories with healthy complex carbs, fruits, starches, intact grains and legumes. With fat ranging from 20 to 35% and protein ranging from 10 to 25%, the reasonable carb ratio ranges from 40 to 70%. Restricting certain macronutrients beyond these ranges is necessary for certain medical conditions. Ketogenic diets on the one hand and a low-fat whole food plant-based diet on the other. You should not worry too much about macronutrient ratios, but you should focus on healthy food choices instead. For example, choose more low-calorie dense foods and less high-calorie dense foods for weight loss. To improve your diet, minimize processed foods and animal products, or cut them out altogether. In addition, eat lots of whole plant foods, including some nuts and seeds. Balanced macronutrient ratios are about 60% carbs, 15% protein, and 25% fat, plus minus 5% for each macronutrient. Protein and fat ratios increase on a large calorie deficit. Thank you so much for watching. Tell us what you thought about this video in the comment section. See you next week.